everyone, welcome. My name is Olivia, and I'm so glad to welcome all of you to our first gathering of Living One's third series of 2025, A Re-Enchanted World. This is the culmination of this year's Living One theme, Seeing the Unseen, Restoration through Re-Enchantment. For those of you who don't already know, Living One is the Carrillo Center for Nonviolence's webinar series, now in its 6th year. The Carrillo Center for Nonviolence is a nonprofit dedicated to generating deep commitment and connection with the world and within ourselves, dissolving divides between human, plant, and animal, mind and body, science and spirit, and self and nature. Through teachings, practice, and community, Carrillo's catalyzes a shift in how we live, relate, and belong, because healing begins when we remember that we were never apart. This third series of conversations, A Re-Enchanted World, continues to explore our exploration into unseen worlds. The mercantile, capitalistic, realist Cartesian paradigm has supported scientific, technological, and industrial advances, but stripped our psyches and imaginations, even our very perceptions and understandings of the richly entangled, convivially connected nature of life on our living planet. Our guest today is Brooke Williams. Brooke's life has been one of adventure and wilderness exploration. His conservation career spans 40 years. His most recent book is Encountering Dragonfly, Notes on the Practice of Re-Enchantment. He's now documenting his quest to know how the planet can make the best use of him. He believes that the length of the past equals the length of the future. He lives near Moab, Utah, with the writer Terry Tempest Williams and 2 cats, where they watch the light and wait for rain. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various Indigenous lands. I am currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk. The Carrillo Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, Takelma, Daku Betete, coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. Thank you all for being here, and I will turn it over to Izzy and Brooke.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and Brooke, welcome to you. It's great to have you here with us. Your bio tells us that you're a conservationist and a writer, but could you just sort of flesh that out a little bit and tell us how you came to be where you are today?
Sure. Thanks, Izzy, and thank you, Olivia. I just really appreciate this opportunity. I can't believe that there's actually a whole series on re-enchantment, which makes me really excited, since I've determined that that's my work from here on out, is to try and re-enchant the world. I love having so many partners in that. So for a long time, I was advocated for wilderness, mainly in southern Utah, which for many of your viewers is a really beautiful natural landscape, the Colorado Plateau. Like everywhere else, we have these issues of, if we protect different wild places, are we making it harder for people to make a living, especially in the rural places? So there's been all those questions I've tried to deal with throughout most of my life. Currently, I'm not actually employed to do that, but I'm on the board of directors of a couple of different organizations. One, the Western Environmental Legal Center, which is a group of lawyers who are working diligently to protect the things that I really care about. I also work with the Center for Humans and Nature, a group out of Chicago, which is really exploring the connection between the natural world and the modern world, which I think is so important these days. The longer I live, the more important it becomes. And I also work with the Utah Rivers Council, who's now really engaged in protecting not only the Colorado River, but the Great Salt Lake, which many of you may have read about, is sort of disappearing due to climate change. And the implications are really serious, because for years, tons and tons and tons of toxic materials have been dumped into this lake from industry. And as the lake goes down, these materials, which are have settled to the bottom, become exposed, and winds can pick up and blow across those exposed toxins, and there's 2.5 million people that will have to breathe this air. So it's not just important for the 20 million birds that migrate through the area, which is very important to me, but also, this population that's called the Wasatch Front, a major city in America, is prone to this kind of toxicity. So anyway, I work on those issues right now, but the main thing I do is write.
That's a very full schedule you have, and an incredibly important work, and thank you for investing in things that matter so much to other Earth beings as well as human beings. We will be focusing on your new book, Encountering Dragonfly: Notes on the Practice of Re-Enchantment. And I guess that a good place to start is, what do you believe that enchantment is? And how is it different, for example, from simply sort of like wow, or loving nature, or, or that kind of thrill of excitement of novelty? What does re-enchantment mean deeply?
What a good question to start with. The idea of like wow and awe and excitement, all those things are really important to me. But I think they're elements. Those come as a surprise. Those come as like unplanned. If you sit around your breakfast table in the morning and say, I think today I'll go out and have some awe in the afternoon. You can't really plan it like that, because part of its nature is the surprise element. Whereas what I've learned about enchantment is that it's like a state of being. And I think it goes back to, we all know what we think when we hear the word enchantment, but it actually is a time in history before which the earth was enchanted and after which it was disenchanted, supposedly. Well, modernity had a great deal to do with that. And for me, it's simple. It's a simple point of view shift. And I think about, for example, trees. We could no longer cut down entire forests of trees to build temples and forts and prisons if those trees still had spirits. So we just had to shift our point of view and say, no, they don't have spirits anymore, so it's fine for us to cut them down. And what that did was take a tree as a subject, which is something from which we learn and with which we interact, and turn it into an object, which is something we manipulate and use for our advantage. And I think that's the simplest description of it for me. And again, it's a shift in point of view, which I love this opportunity to talk to your organization and the people that support you, because I think it is quite simple. It's not like you have to go buy a new outfit or go to school to learn. It's like a shift in the way you see the world. And I want to encourage that, and I think you do too, and I'm so excited.
Yes, so I definitely do. I feel when I go into the woods, I might run down the track listening to my earbuds or whatever. And once I step foot in the place, the earbuds are out, and there is this sort of, open awareness, ready for whatever may come, and there is that just immediate different state of mind, I think. But your enchantment also has this this nature of a journey, which is sort of threaded through by the presence of dragonflies, which as well as dragonflies themselves being sort of enchanting and beautiful and fascinating, that it also operates as a sort of wonderful a necklace, if you like, on which the pearls of wisdom in each chapter can be placed. So how did dragonflies become so important to you? And I think you might want to start with the dream.
Yeah, first I'm thinking about what you just said. That was so articulate about what I'm trying to do here. I really appreciate how carefully you've looked into this book and applied it to your own life. I love that. As far as dragonflies, so going way back, I was a field biologist in college, and I loved being out. I loved learning the way things interacted. I loved everything about the natural world. I loved the amount of attention it required from me. And then, you know, back about 20 years ago, I was at a conference in Canada, and we were on an island, and it was really a lot of work during the day and a lot of play during the night. So we didn't get a lot of sleep. And one day we were given the assignment to go read a paper, and that after lunch we would discuss that paper. Well, I took the paper out to the edge of the ocean and sat against a rock, and I started reading, and I fell asleep. And I had a dream in which a dragonfly appeared. And I was used to dreams. I like dreams. I pay attention to my dreams, going back years to my wife's grandmother, who would always ask us to talk to her about our dreams. She really was good at helping us decide and learn what our dreams meant. So it wasn't that unusual that I remembered this dream. But what was unusual is within minutes of waking up from that nap, having had that dream, I started seeing dragonflies everywhere. Walking back up the trail to this building, I saw dragonflies. When I got to the building, there was a pathway into it, which was lined by a small creek, which had little bunches of cattails. And every little bunch of cattails had a swarm of tiny little blue dragonflies flying about. And I remember saying to a woman standing next to me, I mean, look at this. Isn't this amazing? These beautiful dragonflies are everywhere. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And she said, where have you been? These have been here all week. And in fact, I had probably seen them, but they hadn't really pierced this whatever barrier exists between our conscious and our unconscious worlds. And that just like astounded me. Like I thought back to previous to the dream. And so like before dream, I remember 2 examples of actually seeing dragonflies. And I know I must have seen dragonflies many more times than that. But there were 2 times I can remember seeing them. And since then, there have been hundreds and hundreds of encounters that I've had with them. So something happened. And I don't know how many of you have written books, but it is really the hardest thing ever for me. And if I knew what had happened that day during that dream, I wouldn't have had to write this book because it's too hard. So I wrote the book trying to figure that out, with 2 questions really in mind. One, what happened? What caused dragonflies to pierce that like barrier between my ordinary world and my non-ordinary dream world? And the other question was, how many amazing things can I learn about dragonflies? How much more can I know? So those are 2 questions I tried to answer in this book.
And it turned out that although you'd only just started noticing dragonflies, they had kind of unconsciously been a part of your life for quite a long time, hadn't they? Because you had dragonfly art around your house.
Yeah, that's the weirdest thing because like I said, I was at this conference, and the conference ended, and a couple days later, I end up back at our place, which is outside of Moab in the desert. And I seen things like I had a refrigerator magnet that held like a list on the refrigerator that was shaped like a dragonfly. I found a piece of a plate that was a piece of art that we bought because it was the perfect color. So it had all these green grasses, and it was mostly green, but it had a giant dragonfly at the center of it. I found these things everywhere. So somehow unconsciously, without knowing why, I had gathered them, and now I collect stuff. I have Zuni fetishes that are dragonflies. I have jewelry. I have a tattoo. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, yes.
It's a dragonfly.
Lovely.
Yeah, I have all kinds of things. So they've sort of become an animal helper, so to speak. Yeah.
And one of the things I really loved about the book, and you mentioned it in those two themes that were woven through it, is the way that you draw together a naturalist's observation and knowledge with the imaginal. And before we go into the imaginal side, can you tell us how and why it feels important to you to actually know about dragonflies in terms of the fascinating bits of information and in terms of their life history and how they fly, how they see? Why is that kind of thing, do you feel, important as well as just, being wowed by them?
Yeah, I think that's the most important question. And I'm not sure I was even thinking about this at the time, but lately I've thought a lot about it. And I really have come to believe that, so many of the problems in the world are based on how we define truth. And is there such a thing as pure truth? I mean, I grew up in the Mormon religion, for instance, and I was told that what the truth was, and that if I, responded to the truth in the way that I was taught, I would have all these like amazing things happen to me, especially after life, which didn't really matter to me much. I was more concerned about what happens in this life. And so, I mean, this idea of what's truth, I think, is so important. And lately, it's become very simple for me, in that is that truth is nature, truth is evolution, truth is natural history. Because these things, these dragonflies in particular, but it applies to anything, any biological organism, including humans, we are the result, or the current result, of billions of years of evolution and natural selection. And to me, what could be more purely true than that system that's been at work for so long? Um, and the idea of learning dragonflies, I mean, I mentioned that before my dream, I had two memories of dragonflies. And as far as I was concerned, those dragonflies were both the same, and that every dragonfly you see is the same as any other. Well, it turns out there are, in America alone, over 450 different species of dragonflies. And in the world, I think it's like 5,000. So the important part to me of being attached or intrigued by or obsessed by, in my case, any natural organism, is the amount of attention you have to pay to really learn and study and understand the difference between them. I'll never forget, Terry and I, my wife, do a lot of teaching natural history, and we go on a lot of walks with a lot of students. And I'll never forget having a group of students down in the desert, and we did a plant walk. And I'll never forget one of the students saying, "I can't believe it. Before this, I thought everything that was green was the same. But we had pointed out like 10 different species of wildflowers that had not yet bloomed. And yet this person thought, oh, these must all be the same because they're green." But the dimension of attention that it requires to start to see things in different ways, I feel like, is not only sort of a confirmation of deep truth, but it's this magical thing that happens when you pay that kind of attention. I think if I had to say one thing that I've learned and that I didn't know this book was about, it would be attention.
I have to say, our first series this year was called Attending to the More Than Human World, and it was all about the value of attention, which I totally concur. And just sort of thinking about what you're saying there, I'm in England, as you may be able to tell, and little birds here, they're like chickadees, called blue tits, and there are great tits and coal tits and other marsh tits and willow tits. Anyway, great tits and blue tits are very adaptable to, for example, garden feeders, and will nest in, if you put a nest box in your garden, they will both happily nest in those nest boxes. They're very sort of swift learners. They've done quite a lot of research on, how great tits, for example, pass learning through their family and through their friends, and, how a culture spreads within birds. And the blue tits were the ones who famously opened up milk bottles and drank the cream in the 1970s, a story that you may have heard. Anyway, there are other tits, for example, willow tits, and willow tits they are specifically, they will only nest in a hole in a tree that is close to water. And so they're very specific about where they will go. Now, knowing the sort of like, if you sort of like just thought of them all as tits, then it wouldn't matter whether you never had any rotten trees near marshes anymore. If you are to care about all these different people, you have to know what's particular about them. And I think that, for those of us who are minded to care about the more than human worlds, the fact that these different bird people or insect people have different needs is of critical importance to us. So I really appreciated that.
Well, I could listen to you talk about those birds for the whole hour if we wanted to, because that's exactly the point. And there's no limit to how much you can learn about those birds or dragonflies or anything that anybody else. And I believe, and I don't know if you've ever thought about it, Izzy, but I mean, just the way you spoke about those birds with using your hands, and I could see looking in your eyes, it's like, this is like a passionate thing for you. Have you ever thought about why that is? Why is it penetrated so deeply inside you? But it obviously has.
Well, if I were to describe myself, I'd say I'm probably more interested in trees and mammals than I am in birds, except an awful lot of my attention is paid to birds as well. I'm probably just as interested in everything. It was more that bird idea sort of came to my mind, and I mean, I remember when this is such a tangent. When I had my interview to go to university, I did English literature, and they asked, do you prefer poetry, drama, or novels? And I sort of started out and made a really strong case for why I preferred every single one of those. And I feel like that about the natural world, that whatever you might say, I would say, yeah, that's my favorite. I love it.
Yeah. You bring up a really interesting point. I mentioned earlier the idea of object versus subject. And with birds, I think it's particularly illustrative because my wife and we love bird watching. Mm-hmm. And she goes back to when she was 8 with her grandmother going on Audubon field trips. We found her first field guide. It was when she was like 6 years old. And but her grandmother was so good because so many people on the bus during the field trip, they had their list of birds that they wanted to see. And they would, when they saw the bird, they would check it off and then say, when are we going to go find the next one? Where her grandmother would make her watch that bird and like make notes about what it was doing and pay attention to it. And so with her, the bird was a subject. What can we learn from this bird? How can we interact with it? Versus the other people, the bird was an object, something to check off their list and to put onto their life list, for instance. And I could tell with you, the way you describe those tits, that these birds are like subjects with which you interact and learn from, as opposed to just count. And yes. I think that's another shift in point of view that I was talking about earlier.
Yes, I think it is a crucial one, but we must get back to dragonflies rather than birds, because I know very little about them. And in your book, there was a section about dragonflies' eyes, for example, and I think that would really whet people's appetites to learn more about dragonflies, because that is just astonishing. Can you tell us a little bit about dragonfly sight?
Yeah. Well, there's kind of two different things to talk about. I'll pick one. So the obvious is that most anyone who's looked carefully at a dragonfly or even a picture of a dragonfly one of the things that really stands out are these gigantic eyes that it has. And those eyes enable it to see 360 degrees. And there's a lot of little things going on in those eyes that I learned about. But what I didn't know about was there's a smaller little eye between the two giant eyes. And I learned about this because a friend of mine, well, my obsession was so deep that friends of mine either don't want to, they make a point of saying, are we going to talk about dragonflies if we're out to dinner or not? Because that helps them determine whether to go out to dinner with me. But other people are really interested in it too, and they send me things. And a friend of mine sent me this piece of metal with these cutouts. And if you break out all the pieces and bend them in the right way and attach them, it becomes a dragonfly. Or they also do like airplanes and trains and whatever. But the one I had was a dragonfly. And it was quite accurate. And I started putting it together and it drove me nuts because the pieces were so small. I needed like 2 pairs of pliers and a magnifying glass to put these tiny tabs into these little slots. And the last piece was this piece that went in between the 2 giant eyes. And I didn't know what that was. So I went to the literature and I looked up the anatomy and I found out it's like a third eye. It's called the ocelli, and it helps the dragonfly while it's flying measure the horizon and keep it level, also light and dark. And the magical thing about it is that the neurons that come out of that third eye bypass the brain. They go right to the wings of a dragonfly. And a dragonfly's wings operate, all 4 wings operate independently of each other. And they're all connected directly to this third eye. So the brain is bypassed. And what it does is it turns a dragonfly into like a flying gyroscope. And these creatures are like, for every prey they pick out, they capture like 85%, which makes them the most effective flying predator on the planet. The next closest is like 50% effective, which I think is just fascinating. And what happens is they don't chase their prey; they ambush it. They somehow know where it's going to be, and they fly to that place and they catch it. And the unfortunate thing is the reason we know so much about this particular eye of this particular dragonfly is that the Department of Defense is trying to figure out how to copy it to make drones for warfare, because it's just so amazingly magical. So that's a thing I learned that just kind of blew the top of my head off to understand that. And now, when you watch a pond which has a lot going on, you can pick out the dragonflies because of their just quick movements, the way they change direction so quick, up, down, side to side, back and forth, where everything else is just such an uncomplicated flyer. I mean, you look at grasshoppers, which we have thousands and millions of this year. They're like terrible flyers. They like take off and then they just crash and bounce. Butterflies are sort of just so elegant, moving around. Bees are, as you know, just like on a mission constantly from one flower to the next. But dragonflies are all over the sky in just quick little movements. That's just something that I think is so fascinating to watch. And all you have to do is to look for a minute and pay attention. And then you see that if there are 10 things out there over that pond, there's no question which is the dragonfly, even if you can't tell.
They are astonishing, and the colors of them as well. I mean, just mind-blowingly beautiful. Some of those blues and reds and golds that you get with dragonflies, they're like jewels. In fact, actually, that reminds me, I remember there is one, it's a sort of dung beetle that's in some, I think it's somewhere that is now Mexico, used to be used as like a living ornament because these scarab beetles had particularly, shiny green cases. And I can imagine some peculiar desire to have dragonfly ornaments as well. Not that I would condone dragonflies as ornaments.
Good idea.
Yes. So we're going to talk about the imaginal, and towards the end of the book, you draw together some of the themes of re-enchantment, and I'd like for us to go through them if that's okay. But first, the imaginal realm, what do you mean by that?
So recall that I mentioned earlier that I'm trying to figure out what happened in that dream. And I feel like, part of it was my own personal re-enchantment, but an aspect of that is something I discovered called the imaginal realm, the imaginal world. And it turns out that there's a philosopher, Henry Corbin, Frenchman, who he died in 1977. So he lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And he did his work translating these 8th century Persian mystics. And from this, he coined the term mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. And this is a world, it's not the imaginary world. The imaginary is something completely different. Imaginary is something that we make up. But the imaginal realm is a very real place, somewhere between ordinary reality and what Corbin calls the world of the angels. So it's this existing place that just adds an entire new dimension to our lives. And his idea, and a lot of other people think that our complete ignoring this realm is part of our problem, that we completely don't acknowledge it because it doesn't because we can't prove that it exists, and therefore we've cut ourselves off from the information that is there for us. And for most of our history, our human history, that was a major part of our lives, and we were quite successful. So to me, it's a very interesting idea. What's really interesting to me is I grew up either believing what I was supposed to believe from my religion or believing what had been proven to be true. In other words, what could not be proven to be true did not exist. But now that even these ideas of the imaginal realm, the enchanted world, a lot of these things that I've discussed in the book cannot be proven. I teach a course at Colby College, and the students, I sort of practice a lot of this stuff on these students, and a lot of them roll their eyes back because they don't really believe it. It's not something that they can that has proven to be true for them. So I say to them, look, these things may really exist. This may be true, but it also might not be true. I don't know. But I'll guarantee you that if you live as if these things are true, your life will be much more interesting. And by the end of the course, they all believe that. And I feel like we get to choose. And last April, I was at a conference, and before the conference started, we went around the room and we introduced ourselves. And there was an older woman who introduced herself, and she said that she was a retired math teacher. And she said, I've come a long way from those days of teaching math, but one thing that has stayed with me is this idea in mathematics that something can be true even though it cannot be proven. And I thought, that is amazing, that there's actually a mathematical idea that suggests that if something cannot be proven, it can still be true. Because I thought that if it can't be proven, it not only isn't true, but it doesn't exist. I did a lot of research on this because I sort of got obsessed with it, and it's called the Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which you've heard of. And now people are applying it not only to mathematics, but to everything. And I apply it to what we're talking about here. Just because you can't prove that the imaginal world exists doesn't mean that it doesn't. So you get to pick. We can choose. And I love that.
Yes, certainly enriches your world. And when you were talking earlier about living in an enchanted world and then the process of disenchantment, so ideas of animism, and you write, I quoted the passage from your blog for our introduction to this series to those who have enrolled on the course, where you talk about, it used to be that we would ask that it's stars, or we would, you know, have negotiations with the trees or with the river. And there was this assumption that the world was responsive to us. And I would say that the only way that you can find out if the world is responsive to you or not is by, you know, being open to that communication. If you're already shut off, well, then, you know, it is dead matter, because you're just not open to anything coming towards you. You have to be in that as if place, and then you do feel rewarded. I mean, I certainly do, and it sounds as if you definitely do. Second in that list of in those aspects of enchantment, you talk about the power of rituals, amulets, and fetishes. I was really interested in that. We've talked a little bit about rituals in previous episodes, and I wanted to understand from you why you think those can be so powerful and important.
Well, it's like, you know, I love the idea that we all grew up thinking that we have to see something in order to believe it. But I think the shift is we have to believe something in order to see it. And you can look at ritual, you can look at fetishes, you can look at amulets that for thousands of generations our species paid very close attention to. And for some reason we no longer do that except for in very religious contexts. My point is that if it worked for so long, why don't we like even make an attempt at understanding why, or using these in our own lives? And I think it's really fascinating. Like I said, it's a shift in point of view. And I found that when it comes to objects, for instance, um, like a lot of times I'll go into like a store. There's a lot of them around us that sell Native American arts and crafts. And my wife and I collect these Zuni fetishes that are, you know, small animals, usually animals or birds that are carved by amazing artists. And there'll be a cabinet of these. And I swear I'm not making this up, but there will be one that somehow seems lit up, like it's important to me. And I think that that's my unconscious telling me there's something about that particular creature that I need right now. And it's a very specific feeling. And I realized that for most of my life I would have ignored it because it doesn't make any sense. But since I've started paying attention to these things, you know, the writer Arnold Mindell, I read a lot of his books. I read a lot of his books. He just passed away. But he has this idea in one of them of flirting. And it's not flirting like we're used to talking about flirting, but it's this idea that something that flirts with you, that attracts your attention, is important to you right now. And you have to pay attention to what attracts your attention. I don't know how many of you have been on walks in nature, specifically with other people, and specifically children. You can take 10 children on a half-mile walk and ask them what they saw, and no two children will say they saw the same thing. That's because something different was flirting with everyone. And I love that idea. And especially when it comes to like, all right, let's talk about why that might have attracted your attention, for instance. But I think this applies with, you know, to amulets and to, in the same way that it applies to rituals, where you can perform your own rituals, you can make them up, you can, we have many indigenous friends who use ritual from their deep past and have shared them with us. And there's something just so exciting about being part of a tradition that's thousands of years old versus the very short histories that most of us live with and are conscious of. And what have we got to lose is my main question. These things have been used specifically by humans for thousands of generations very successfully. We don't do it much anymore. What happens if we try to reinvigorate those kinds of traditions? What do we got to lose? Especially these days when nothing else seems to be working.
I think it's a wonderful idea. I went recently on a pilgrimage, which was you know, take whatever faith you want there, but be paying attention to the landscape. And it was around the stone circles of Avebury, not which is just a short distance from Stonehenge, but actually the largest stone circle in the world. And so there was, you know, these stones were you know, they're thousands and thousands of years old, that they were raised by people, and you know, 200 of them, 200 that weigh more than a ton each, by people before wheels. You know, I mean, it's just astonishing. And that feeling of something about a place, I mean, you can feel a whole place flirting with you, like is it called the genius loci, the genius of the place, the sense of place? And you know, and it strikes me that for different animals, certainly for elephants, I'm sure that elephants experience that genius loci at certain places just as we do. And a dragonfly with their territory, I mean, who knows what has flirted within
Yeah.
that territory for the dragonfly to, I mean, apart from it being on a riverbank and somewhere that it can stand up, but you know, that it does draw you into another way of thinking about the world.
It
That
adds a whole dimension to it, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally,
Yeah.
totally. I love that. Next, miracles. And you write, it's been a subtle shift in point of view to see first that everything is a miracle and then discover why, to see that every moment is significant, nothing a coincidence. Can you expand on that? As I think that is key.
Yeah, I think Einstein gets a credit for that quote where he said either everything is a miracle or nothing is a miracle. I'm not sure he really said it, but I love the idea. And it's just the way you look at it.
Mm,
And I think of it in terms of a miracle, you know, religiously has a different sort of context than I see it. I see a miracle as that everything has significance. Every moment is important. I love thinking about, I think it was Ortega y Gasset, that philosopher, talking about ancient hunters. And he said that a hunter knows only one thing, that he does not know what will happen next. And I think that kind of attention suggests that everything around him or her is miraculous, and that has like this deep potential for
yeah.
whatever you want it to have. I feel like, and that's a subtle point of, that's a shift in point of view. Like I try to do a little bit of a practice about this, because like you stand in the line waiting to pay for your groceries, for instance, and you know, everyone's like looking at their phone to see that whatever happened, or whoever sent them a text, or who wants them to buy something. But if you just stand there and look around and realize that there's one thing, for instance, that may be trying to attract your attention, then it adds a whole other dimension to your life. And that kind of attention, I think, is really active versus the kind of attention now that is it's a passive attention. It's like our attention's being hijacked by all this social media and everything around us, constantly wanting us to buy something, or wanting us to be somebody that we're not, or whatever. I just love thinking that there's so much more to it if we can be attentively active as opposed to passive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I totally agree with you about that change of perspective. And I think it is completely a key part of the recipe of enchantment. The fourth one you suggest, and I love this. In fact, I've decided that this is going to be my new profession from here on in. Imaginal ecology. So for those who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading your book, can you explain what imaginal ecology is?
Yeah, so we've already talked about the imaginal
Mm,
world, and it's been expanded to imaginal ecology because of the relationship aspect. Ecology, in its simplest forms, is about relationships between different organisms, for instance. One thing that really happened to me was I've happened upon an article that was written in, I think, 2008, about imaginal ecology, which I'd never heard of before. But in this essay, the author Kevin Rickstad, who's a Canadian, was his search for really thinking about the environmental movement. And his question was fascinating. His question was, do we really understand the full dimension of this world that we're trying to protect, of nature that we're trying to protect? Do we really understand it? And he went into this whole idea, and it's where I first read of Henry Corbin. But he called it ecology, and one thing led to another, and he and I have been in touch a bit. I quoted him in the book. But this idea of not just the relationship aspect of ecology, but if many of us in this like chat room right now, and you in particular, Izzy, you consider yourselves ecologists at any level, then imaginal ecology to me adds a couple of dimensions to what we've already thought about in terms of ecology. And I think it's easier for me to talk about if I talk about natural history, for instance, which natural history is a specific way of understanding ecology, because once you understand these different aspects of different organisms, you understand how they relate to each other. Right now, natural history is what a creature looks like, its habitat, what it eats, all those different physical aspects of it. But to me, imaginal natural history adds a couple of dimensions. It adds like anecdotal stories about that particular creature. It adds historical significance. But then what happened to me was, the dream aspect of it. So imaginal natural history also has to include archetypal and symbolic meaning for those creatures. So in a sense, it's not saying that science or what we know to be true is wrong. It says, no, let's just expand that and include those different aspects when we start thinking about natural history. So to me, that's what it's all about. It's just an expansion of what is traditional.
Yes, that and I love that way of taking all perspectives of something. There's a lovely quote by Mary Warnock, which I will totally misquote. She says something like, there's no one way of seeing the world. There are many ways of seeing the world, and every honest way, or every sort of genuinely achieved way has truth, is part of the truth. And that idea of those sort of like myriad perspectives on something that you can't. And it also means that from our own point of view, there is always this hiddenness, because there are these various other points of view that could have something that we, with whatever kind of minds we have, whatever kind of senses we have, can't approach. That everything is always bigger and vaster. And I think that sense sort of adds to enchantment as well. That it won't be in our control. It won't be totally in our purview.
Exactly. That's really well put. I completely believe that. And I also believe that we'll never know everything there is to know about these creatures. And it's a lifelong, search to learn more and more. And, the way you describe the different birds, the different tits, that's can be purely observational. And if you spend your time watching those different birds, you're going to probably see things that no one has seen before, or no one has known.
And especially, I mean, there are in my garden, the birds in my garden are common garden birds, and not an awful lot of endeavor is put into studying those birds, because they're not rare, they're not endangered, they're not big charismatic, they're small brown jobs largely. And when you spend a long time with them, you hear different calls, conversations, and see different types of behavior that just aren't mentioned in books because no one cares. And you realize almost everything, there is this depth of sort of unknownness with almost everything. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, you make a really good point because what you see in books, the great thing about natural history is that particular organisms act in a very specific way, and we can determine which is which by how they act.
Mm.
But what you're describing is maybe that these birds have different personalities,
Yeah.
which we're sort of unwilling to acknowledge that they might. But that's probably true. And I don't know if you've seen it, but speaking of backyard birds, Amy Tan, that great author, novelist, I think during the pandemic started watching birds in her backyard, and she's written a book on, I forget the name of it, but it's about what she's learned about birds just watching the ones in her backyard. And she's
Oh,
watched them
wow.
so carefully that she's actually started painting them, and she's really a great artist also. But a lot of what she talks about are some of the birds that she kind of got to know on a more personal level.
You know,
And
there's a book I think you'd really love, which you may not know because it's out of print and it's largely unheard of. And the writer, oh gosh, now I can't. It's called Birds Are Individuals, and she was in the 1950s in London, and she was a trained musician. A violinist, I think, or a cellist or something, but a trained musician. And she left the London Symphony Orchestra, moved out into the country, and she'd always loved nature. And she spent time watching. She's called Len Howard. That's it. It sprung to my mind. And she spent time just watching these birds, and she wrote two books, and the one's called Birds as Individuals, and it is largely anecdotal, but the stories, but she was watching them for 20 years, knowing these small birds, lots of tits, as individuals. And so she named them so she was like Jane Goodall at exactly the same era as Jane Goodall. But because they're not chimpanzees or they're not, Diane Fossey's gorillas, they're, great tits and blue tits, she's never really had any recognition, but she was doing exactly the same thing.
yeah,
And the individuality really comes through, hence the name of the book, Birds as Individuals. But I'm taking you off on a tangent again. Sorry.
that's all right. I mean, it's fascinating, and I believe it.
You tell some incredibly moving stories in the book, and I was wondering if you'd be able to share one or two, perhaps the story of Chris and the Canada darter.
The Canada Darner, yeah. So that story, there's an organization called Round River Conservation Studies, and I've done some work for them. And they work all over the world on large scale conservation projects. And one of them in particular was up in the Taku region of British Columbia. It's got a huge wilderness, traditional homeland of the Taku River Tlingit Indian tribe. A mining company wanted to build a road through the center of this gigantic piece of wilderness, which would have, we all know what roads do to wild places. Round River was trying to stop that. And one thing they did was realize that the Taku River Tlingit, who had been confined to a reservation nearby, if they would re-inhabit their homeland, it would be much easier to protect this place. And it took years and years and years, but there was a lot of interesting stuff that happened in terms of re-inhabiting their homeland also meant that they'd start eating salmon again, which was what they had always done. And long story short, I was involved in sort of documenting some of these things that were happening. And the first time I ever went there, we had to fly into, I flew in by myself to, I can't remember, Whitehorse, to the Whitehorse Airport. And Chris, who worked for them, picked me up. And we had to take two vehicles back to I think it was like 50 miles back to where we were staying, where our headquarters was. And there were huge swarms of dragonflies that we drove through. And I had to go slow because I feel like there's a particular speed that you can drive through, like butterfly migrations and anything, where they'll just sort of flow over your car instead of like smash into your windshield. So he pulled over to let me catch up, and I said, "Could you believe all those dragonflies?" And he said, "Well, I noticed a few, but..." And I told him what I had seen, and he couldn't believe that he had like passed through those without really much attention, like I would have years before. And I told him how important dragonflies were to me, all I was learning about them, and that they were my animal helper. And he kind of shrugged him. He's a scientist. He sort of like rolled his eyes back. It's the first day I'd met him, so I was a little embarrassed to like share this much with him. But so fast forward a day or two, and we get invited to dinner at one of his friend's house near Atlin. And we were out in the yard playing some games, and this wasp started flying around my head, and I was worried that it might like want to sting me. You know, when a wasp flies around your head, you don't want to like be nearby. So I was swatting it away, and it kept flying around. And then all of a sudden, I felt something hit my hat, and I pulled off my hat, and a dragonfly had grabbed this wasp out of the air and landed on my hat. And it was like it had killed this wasp. And Chris was standing right next to me, and he looked at me like, "Oh, I get it now." So he had his attention had been piqued by the swarms that we saw, and that the way I talked about them, and then to see this actually happen next to him, to where a dragonfly was like protecting me, it added a whole other dimension to his life too.
I'm going to have to hand over in case people have got some questions for you, which I'm sure they will. They can put them in the chat. I see Eileen's written something there already, and others may have something to ask. But before I hand over to the audience, two all important questions. So, and I know we've covered them throughout our conversation, but just to really underline why enchantment matters now, and how did it change the way you experience the world and the way you act. So essentially, if we were all to experience the world in this enchanted sense, what change would it make for the vast numbers of more than humans who currently are to a great extent suffering through the way that we normally behave?
Well, I think that's the $1 million question. I think for everyone, it's like an individual. It's a very individual thing. There's no one way to deal with the problems that we face. I feel like if we can become enchanted, or if we can realize our own personal re-enchantment. First of all, I don't think the world has ever been disenchanted, really. I just think it's people who are disenchanted. And I feel like the dream was the moment of my own personal re-enchantment. And so I've been sort of discovering what that was all about. And if in fact the disenchantment of the world was really the commodification of nature, for instance, where we started to, I talked about it earlier, where we take these subjects and they become objects for our use. And every natural resource has been that, where we've found these things that are valuable to us, and we manipulate them, and we dig them up, and we use them. And if you apply that to carbon, for instance, as a natural resource that we've commodified, we found it, we figured out how to burn it, we powered our entire civilization with it, and now the waste from it is causing probably the most serious problem our species has ever faced, climate change. So what I've been able to do in my naivete is extrapolate a little bit and say that if climate change is rooted in the disenchantment of the world, then wouldn't the solution to climate change have something to do with re-enchantment? So to me, it's a very simple thing, and that's why I'm on this mission, and why I'm so happy to be joined with your mission of re-enchantment because I believe that that's part of the solution to the major problem that we have these days.
And how else is your mission going to manifest itself? I mean, can we sort of man some barricades with you, or or attend some, I don't know, what re-enchanters do to carry out their mission.
That's a good question. I think it's individual for everyone. I feel like if we discover that place inside of us that is enchanted, I also feel like it's our evolutionary spark. There's like this spark of evolution that we are still humans on Earth that are subject to these natural selection, and we're still evolving, even though it's not maybe physical evolution as much as it's conscious. I feel like if we touch into that, we will know individually what we're supposed to be doing, how the world can make the best use of us is my question.
Yeah.
And it's not the same for everyone. There's no formula for it. But I feel like living in this way, we'll know. I'm thinking a lot lately about the whole idea of courage, and as courage as possibly the sort of enactment of evolution is what does courage mean to us? And I mean, courage is about overcoming fear. I'm starting to ask myself a lot of questions about what that really looks like and what kind of courage is required these days, but also what kind of courage, or what is courage to me? What does that look like? What is doing something that is really uncomfortable for the greater good? What does that look like in my own personal life? And I feel like we're all asking ourselves the same question. And I think enchantment has the potential of helping us find the answer to that question.
I hope so. I truly hope so. And courage and commitment too. I think, commitment is something that Gay's rightly bringing up a lot. And I think, you need courage to be committed, but you need commitment to enact your courage. A lot of the time we can believe something, say something, want something, berate others for not doing something, rail against the circumstance of something. But there does seem to be sort of like lacking sometimes courage and sometimes commitment too, perhaps. And I wonder if enchantment also can have the power to sort of strengthen the commitment ropes as well.
Yeah. Well, I think at a certain level, if being enchanted is, I think, finding something that you're so passionate about you have to do, and you don't even have to think about it in terms of commitment or in terms of somehow discipline. I think it's just a natural way of existing. And
Yes.
I mean, I might be totally idealistic about that, but I don't know. That's my story, and that's the one I'm telling, and I don't know. Will prove me wrong, you know?
No, that's yeah, I think you're right, actually. Yes, that makes sense. I mean, I had a sort of my kind of moment of enchantment, sort of. I mean, I think I'm kind of blessed with a certain kind of naivete faced with the world anyway. So that sort of like beginner's mind thing has never entirely left me. That childish wonder thing has never entirely left me. But then I was doing a poetry course, and the poetry course kind of was encouraging you to sort of sit down and talk to plants. And I wanted to write the poems, but I thought that the talking to plants was probably silly. And, but I did the whole thing. I sat there for a long time with an ash tree. And then, I went home and kind of thought about the ash tree while sort of like just sitting there, focused my mind on the ash tree, and was thinking, this is silly. And then all of a sudden I heard a voice, don't fence me in. And and it, you know, it had taken quite a long time to get this message from the ash tree, but that was enough for me to think, oh my God, I can, you know, there is something there, and wherever this comes from, whether it's from a collective unconscious, from my unconscious, from an ash tree, from, you know, Gaia, didn't matter. It still doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that I feel like there is a source of there is a source outside myself that I can tap into by really caring and having this state of openness, and that directs me. I mean, it's just what I do now.
Yeah. Well, the fact that you sitting by an ash tree, probably somewhere in England, and you get the title of a song from, I think, cowboys in the Western U.S. Isn't
So I've heard. I didn't know it was until I said it to another American a few
yeah.
weeks back, and they were saying that's a song. I didn't know it was a song.
So I think that is proof enough right there that something else is going on, right?
There was my inner cowboy was speaking to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
I'm to go barrel racing. I knew there was something. um, let me talk. Oh, we've got a message from Mike and a message from Eileen. Eileen was first, and Eileen, who's got a rather wonderful sort of emoji there. I don't know if you want to ask your question or if I should read it out. If I see your unmuting happen,
Yeah, you
yes.
can read it out.
Oh, I can read it out. Okay. Science has finally caught up with the innate ancestral and evolutionary knowledge that's in every cell of our bodies. I've doubted my own wisdom too many times to count.
I don't know why it's not showing me, but I'm unmuted. So,
oh, there you. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just want. It was a comment, really, that in some of my other studies that I'm doing as an end of life doula, this is a concept that's talked about a lot of time, all the time. The seen and the unseen, what can be proven, what's not proven. And I've had so many examples of it and so many times of doubting my own knowledge that I'm sorry, I have a migraine. That's why I look like this. So I just think the idea of enchantment, and of course the natural world provides endless opportunities for that, but are in moments of connection between humans and non-human animals, humans and plants and trees. And it's kind of sad that we need proof that, you know, when we know what we know, and yet we deny what we know because there isn't the math to prove it, or the medical reference range, or, you know, the scientific experiment that says, you know, this is absolute. And we lived that way for hundreds of thousands of years and evolved that way. And we just need to tune back into it, I think.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing work that you do as a death doula. I think maybe you've had some experience with this, but it seems like often when I'm talking about dragonflies, somebody says, I can't believe it, but when my aunt died, all of a sudden dragonflies started appearing to us. I hear it all the time. And, you know, there's a lot of literature to suggest that many indigenous cultures believe that dragonflies are associated with death. They carry the souls of the dead, many different things. And the whole point is that I'm trying to make is, if cultures throughout the world think that this is true, then there must be something to it. And I just love thinking about that. And there's experiences that I write about in the book where dragonflies are associated with death, and that's a kind of a major theme. So, Eileen, have you experienced anything like that in your work?
I have, and I guess I didn't call it a dragonfly, and this was prior to my work and part of the inspiration of my work. When my mother was dying, and this was back in the early 90s, I was staying overnight with her in the hospital, and something woke me up. And I, of course, check all the monitors, and everything's fine. She's sound asleep. She seems comfortable. And I thought to myself, oh, it was just a fairy. Go back to sleep. Now I come from a long Celtic heritage on both sides of my family. And so fairy was the word that came to mind. But it certainly could have been a butterfly. And my most beloved animal communicator, who's changed form and is no longer incarnated, believed also that birds were representative of angels and death and spirituality, because they showed up so often around times when people were dying. So I have experienced a lot of really miraculous things that are not explainable, including things that just change in an instant, like forgiveness, that can just totally transform someone's life when there's forgiveness at the end of life.
Yeah.
So I am enchanted by all the things that I've always felt and seen and thought I was crazy. And maybe I'm neurodivergent, but I'm not crazy. That's for sure.
Yeah. Thank
So
you for that.
yeah, it's an opening for, I think grief is an opening for, is an opportunity for opening.
Yeah.
We want to constrict around grief and pain and loss. And yet what is called for is the opposite, is to open more.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Were there other questions down here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there is. There's Mike. And Mike, he's up and running, so I'm sure he'll ask it in person.
Hi, Mike.
Yes, I'm a veterinarian, and I've had to deal with death over and over and over and over. But it's an amazing experience. It's emotional. You get in a room with somebody that's totally one with their animal, or you get a family in a room that's one with their animal. And the time has come, and you have to perform this next experience. And when I do that, there seems to be a change in phase that I can't explain. There's energy and there's matter that are transformed in a moment. I don't know. And where does the energy go? Where does the matter go? E equals MC squared. I think it's forever. So when you brought up that concept of the imaginal state, that blew me away. I thought, maybe is there a continuity of the imaginal state that we don't recognize? So death is just a phase, not a reality. It's a phase in change from one change to another, but the imaginal state remains. There's no beginning and there's no end. It's like the universe. And so when I look at extinction, it seems like that's forever, but maybe it isn't forever, because there has to be, this is a transition, and we create that transition to a degree as humanity, and the things we do, and the impacts we have. We create that change. But this state you mentioned really shook me, because it looks like and I always, when I have to deal with what I call the guardian of the animal, and this is done, I don't like to admit to this is the end of it. I don't like to admit the end of it, because I feel a change in the atmosphere when I have to do that. You go from a perfection of billions of cells, all of a sudden, that just can't disappear. I always felt that when I have to do that. And then when you bring up this imaginal state, it just brings a whole new dimension to my life when you said that.
Well, I think you've
I don't know
experienced
whether
it.
you'd even agree with that or think it's crazy or what.
Mike, I do not think that's crazy. I believe it completely. I think that your own experience, like me, you have these experiences, and you're trying to figure out how to make sense of them. And by me bringing up the idea of the imaginal, that's some words to help you describe what you experience. And your experience is pure, and your experience is real, and that's what we all need to hear more of, is personal experience like that. But I think it's amazing. I mean, what you've just described is, I mean, more and more I read about the physicists are getting closer and closer to describing what really happens at death. And like you said, it's not an ending, it's a shift in phases. Like, I love that, I forget, what can I think of his name, who said, death is like taking off a tight shoe. And I mean, for humans, and I love that quote. And what you've described with animals from your own experience is getting a sense of a phase change. It's not something that you were looking for. You just experienced that, and there's no way you'll ever doubt it. Something is going on. And the biggest problem we have is describing what it is as opposed to actually experiencing it.
Well,
Thank you for that.
It just seems like you want to tell the owner this is just a change in dimension.
Yeah.
It's reality in one dimension, and it's a new reality in another dimension.
Yeah.
But it isn't the end.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. I don't know if anyone else has any particular questions that they'd like to raise. Gay.
Tried to keep quiet all this time. Thank you so much, Brooke. It was just amazing. I have, you brought up some things, and I have all these little zings, like Arnie Mendel, who, if anyone doesn't know him, like you did, he unfortunately passed, unfortunately in the sense of, his active presence here, but he's extraordinary. He was a physicist and was studying postgraduate work in Switzerland, and then quote unquote discovered Jung, and was an amazing person. And I was fortunate enough to actually see him in action. But I do encourage reading his books, and his wife is still very active. And then talking about miracles, I was thinking about Harvey, the fly specks on the corner of 18th and whatever. Anyways, but I did want to come back to the concept of, because my name was used in vain, about commitment and courage. And I wonder, Brooke, if you could just say a little bit about courage. My feeling is that and this is, as I said at the beginning, why I loved your book so much, is because it does pierce this kind of membrane of separation. And as someone I think has mentioned, there's this concept in Buddhism, particularly brought up by Thich Nhat Hanh, of the no self, where all of these different forms and these, wonderful things of enchantment, we're part of that, and but the notion of courage, I guess I'd like you to talk about that, because I think it's very easy, which you don't do, for at least a certain sector of humanity to get caught up in, ooh, wow, like Izzy talked about, wow, neat. But what is that courage? I mean, I have my own definition of it. And the commitment is that when we, it's kind of like when you know something or when you learn something, what do you do with it? There's a tendency in a sense, like the Audubon people with the lists, right? To just sort of I'm not saying all of them, but there's this notion of sort of, kind of miserly gathering information and detail and knowledge, quote unquote. And so this whole notion of courage and commitment is, well, what do you do with it? These are great gifts. And there is a commitment, which the non-human world has. It's a fidelity to land and a fidelity to life. That's my opinion. But what would you call courage that you brought up? What is the courage? My answer is the courage is that we have the courage, like a number of people have spoken, is to really be responsible and accountable for plumbing our truth and speaking that truth, with the notion of having the responsibility of accountability for what that is. It's not like I feel, therefore I am. So the courage, to me, I have my own kind of concept of that, but I'd like to hear you talk about what that means for you.
That's a good question because I'm just really starting to think about it. I think I mentioned earlier that it's too hard to write a book without a question for me. And my next question is, what is it about courage that is like a gigantic step for each of us in terms of, I mean, I can't, there's not a day that goes by that I don't have a conversation with somebody these days who says, what can we do? I mean, everyone is so frustrated watching what's happening in Washington and elsewhere. What is it that we can really do? And I feel like, if we get to the essence of our true self, we know what to do. But then the question is, do we have the courage to actually do it? I used to spend a lot of time outdoors and mainly skiing big, dangerous slopes. And I finally stopped when people started dying in avalanches. Then we learned everything about avalanches that we could, and we learned how to rescue people from avalanches. And I always asked myself the question, if somebody I was with was caught in an avalanche, and I knew exactly what to do to make sure that I was able to dig them out before they suffocated under the snow, would I be able to do it? I always ask myself the question, if I'm driving along the road and I see a terrible accident, do I have what it takes to help the people inside that accident? Or would my body just freeze up in terms of by the fear of it? So I'm talking about that kind of courage that it may take, who knows? There's 1,000 different things that need to be done, and there's 10,000 different things that are going to require courage from many different levels from all of us. And as I mentioned, I feel like it's really an aspect of the next phase of our evolution is what kind of courage is it going to take to us to make the conscious steps that are required to do what's necessary to get us to the next level, to get us past this place we are right now. That's what I want to write about, and I'm not even sure what forms that's going to take or whatever, but I just feel like I want to ask the question of what would courage look like if there was no fear? Because courage really doesn't exist without fear, right? Isn't courage responding to something we're afraid of that's going to be difficult? But what is courage? What is just doing it? How can we eliminate that fear and just do whatever it takes? And I think it's different for everyone. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I don't have an answer for your question. I'm exploring it for sure. And I think for me, it's lit up right now, and I'm thinking a lot about it.
That's terrific. I've mentioned this before, but I will again. I wrote this piece up. It's called The Kindness Instinct. And it was an article that I read years ago. It was about this man, I think it was back east, and it's really cold. The rivers are frozen. And he's trudging along and going to work or whatever. And he looks over and he sees this dog drowning in the river, right, with the ice. And so he takes off his jacket and coat and he jumps in. He saves the dog. And of course, then he's reported, and he's sitting with the paramedics with the silver thing. And a reporter comes up to him and says, wow, that was amazing. What made you do it? And he goes, I don't know. I don't even like dogs. And I guess, I'm bringing that up as kind of an offering to you. To me, that kind of maybe touches in terms of what that courage is and gets into this notion of truth. I mean, he was, in my opinion, when I look at it, he's responding to truth and to a truth, whatever he quote unquote feels. It's a kind of a truth, just like we see in these, numerous videos now of, elephants protecting, I don't know, a warthog or somebody, because a lion's attacking. I mean, I think that they're these sort of elemental things. And I had a conversation yesterday with someone who's younger than me, and I was reminiscing, and he was reminiscing about his mother, who's probably my age, about hitchhiking and how great hitchhiking was. And that, and so we were just talking. I said, well, maybe we should all start hitchhiking, and maybe we should all start picking up people who are, hitchhikers, as kind of an anecdote, again, to break through that notion, getting back to, I mean, not doing quote unquote foolish things, but in the sense of really recalibrating, how much am I really worth? What is really at stake, and what are we really defending when we don't act and we don't speak what we really know in our truth?
Yeah.
Anyways,
Those
that's
are
my
the
that's
universal
my
questions.
little speech there. And Gödel's theme, it's interesting too that, again, this was part of our arc of our trying to get you to look at the rest of the series that we had, but that Izzy put together. But one of them was on non-dualism with an NDE, near-death experience, Pim von Lommel, and things like that, to really kind of expand and to really letting go of dualism to non-dualism, which in my opinion is just letting go of these preconceived ideas. So it's not really moving to a different view rather than giving up these entrenched kinds of views, which I do think relate to what you're going to be writing about, is this notion of what courage is.
Yeah.
So keep writing so we can read another one, interview again.
That would be fun. That's good incentive. Thank you.
Anne had her hand up, and we'll make this the last question, because I appreciate, Brooke, we've taken up 90 minutes of your time when you're at your in-laws' house. So Anne, please ask your question.
Well, I was just thinking when you were answering the question about courage, Brooke, that the courage that you were speaking about at that moment comes to me as big courage. But then I was thinking about what I consider a smaller courage, or something, which is the story that you told about sharing what you think about dragonflies on the first day with the person that you met in Canada. And then Gay talked about it some, so it was sort of answered. But my own experiences with the small courage, which is the risk is being thought of as foolish or stupid, or being discounted and disregarded because you're, the tree hugger or the whatever. But once my experience is that once I have started opening up and talking about non-humans as being people, not things, and having individual personalities, and speaking directly to plants and animals rather than about them, and talking about my desire to actually do something bigger than recycling, that the response from other people is phenomenally better than I ever imagined that it could be. And there certainly are people who still discount and roll their eyes and whatever, but that smaller courage, how did we get to the point that we don't want to speak the truth, that we're afraid to do so? And so all of that was just kind of jumbling through, and both you and Gay have talked a lot about it. So that was it. And thank you so much. The conversation between you and Izzy has been phenomenal to witness.
Well, thank you, Anne. And I think that's a really great thing to end on, that whole idea of those small courages that can occur every single day to just spread this word. And the fact is, like you said, by opening yourself up, you allow other people to know that it's okay for them to open up too. And I don't think it takes half of us or 3/4 of us to make gigantic changes. It's just one at a time, little by little. And I think this conversation is one of those, and those that you just described are how we take what we've thought and heard and referenced today into the next step. The minute we walk out the door, how does that change the world? I think that's the magic of all this. And I really appreciate talking to all of you about it and hearing what you had to say. And I look forward to the rest of this series and talking about my next book on this platform. Hopefully it won't take as long as the last book.
Thank you so much, Brooke, for your time today. It has been an absolute delight, and we were all sure it would be after Gay and I anyway, having read your book. But
Izzy, can I know it's a beautiful ending, but could I add just one more question to Brooke? I'm so sorry. And then you can make it a really nice ending. I couldn't help but think at one point in your discussion about Lévi-Brul's Participation Mystique, since you were talking about Henri Corbin. Are you familiar with his work?
No.
Okay, well, I'm only bringing that up because what you described was very much like that, where, I mean, he's of that kind of thing. He was an French anthropologist, and he worked on.
I've heard of him, but I just don't know anything. Yeah.
Well, it says no. It's very similar to the Buddhist concept of no self, where he was looking at quote unquote primitive tribes of blah blah blah, where that they really didn't have a defined self. You see what I mean? And so they were non-differentiated around the forests and animals with whom they lived. So I just mentioned that because from what something that you mentioned earlier in your discussion kind of zinged that, and I thought that might be of interest, or maybe you had already thought about it.
Totally. I can't wait to look that up. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to wreck the ending.
You never wreck anything, Gay. You couldn't possibly. But anyway, yes. Thank you, Brooke, and we've totally enjoyed your participation, and the mystique will stay with us. That was so awful, wasn't it? And I will
Very
hand
clever.
over. Thank you very much indeed, and we will look forward to inviting you back. I give you 18 months to get that written and published, and I'm a tough taskmaster. Have courage, and I will hand over to Deeksha for to sign us off. Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you.
Thanks, Izzy. Thank you, Gay. Thanks, Brooke. It was such a nice conversation and beautiful questions from everyone. Our next Living One speaker will be a week from today on Friday, August 29th. We will be welcoming anthropologist Harry Wells and climate poet Saskia Stehoover, who will be telling us about their joint project, The Wonder Search. Now, before we go, I'm just going to share my screen real quick. All right. Can everybody see that? Yes? Okay. Before you go, let me introduce Mama. She is a wild deer who always brings with her a sense of enchantment. Mama will be visiting Grace Village she has been visiting Grace Village for more than 10 years, and Gay has developed a close relationship with her. When times are hard for the deer, our Grace Village is always there to provide refuge, sustenance, and sanctuary. Mama, as Gay tells us, is wise as well as graceful, a loving mother and a real defender of her family and matriarch of the deer clan. Your support helps Grace Village continue to revitalize enchantment by providing respect and sanctuary for the residents and visitors like Mama. So please consider donating at the link on our website, Kerulos.org. So once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brooke, for sharing your time with us. As always, from all of us here at Kerulos, we really appreciate you being here. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
See you next time.